Hello and welcome to the Lore of the Cards podcast, the podcast that uses Hearthstone as a vehicle to unpack the dense and sometimes complex lore of the Warcraft universe. Last time, we finished the story of the decorated paladin hero, Uther the Lightbringer. Now we're taking a look at the other side of the coin. Where there are those that serve the light, there are also those that serve the shadow, and none have served it more eagerly or emphatically than the Hearthstone Warlock hero, Gul'dan. Unlike many of the key races of the Warcraft universe, such as humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, trolls and Tauren, orcs are not native to the world of Azeroth. The orcs were a race born to the savage world of Draenor. A little over 800 years ago, Orc society developed a clan structure. The largest of these clans would be the Blackrock, the Laughing Skull, the Lightning's Blade and the Dragonmaw clans. Many of these clans survive to this day. Over time, other clans would also form, some big and some small. Some would endure, others would not. Gul'dan would be born into one of the smaller clans, which had only a small village in the region of Gorgrond to their name. Gul'dan was born weak and deformed, which made him the target of abuse and mockery throughout the entirety of his early life. Orcs are a somewhat superstitious race, and Gul'dan's clan viewed his deformity as an ill omen. As a result, Gul'dan grew to despise his fellow clansmen. Only the clan's elder shaman ever treated Gul'dan with any kindness. However, though the elderly orc did his best to help Gul'dan find his place among the clan, a combination of the constant bullying and Gul'dan's resentment towards his own people made this an impossible task. In the year 10 BFD, this taunting came to a head. Members of the clan beat Gul'dan to within an inch of his life. At the last moment, the elder shaman stepped in, stopping the rain of blows. The shaman told the deformed orc that there was no more he could do for him. He said he'd failed to integrate Gul'dan into their clan, but he also told the young orc he still saw greatness within him. The shaman encouraged Gul'dan to seek out the throne of the elements, and that perhaps there the deformed orc would find his destiny. The throne of the elements is home to the four most powerful elemental spirits of Draenor, the Furies of Wind, Earth, Water and Fire. It was here the orcs of the Shadowmoon clan first learnt the art of shamanism. Fledgling shaman would partake in pilgrimages to the throne, entering trances to attune their minds to the elements and requesting the blessing of Draenor's elements. Despite both the shaman's faith and the old man resting a comforting hand upon Gul'dan's shoulder, Gul'dan slapped the friendly shaman's hand away in anger, rejecting him. This was the last straw for the clan's chieftain. He cast Gul'dan out from the clan. This exile in the wastes of Gorgrond would show Gul'dan what it was truly like to have no people. For months, Gul'dan bitterly wandered the wastes, resentment for his clan spurring him on. He had not needed the shaman to tell him. Gul'dan was already convinced that he was destined for greatness, but he also knew that his deformity would never allow him to achieve his potential within the structure of his clan. However, he was starving and barely able to walk, carrion birds circling overhead, waiting for him to expire. Gul'dan thought the safety and shelter of a clan may be better than endless suffering, no matter how much he may hate them. Gul'dan was at his weakest when, after falling to the ground, the carrion birds watching him landed, a little too eager to gorge. Gul'dan fought them off, but broke his walking cane during the struggle. Now unable to prop himself up as he walked, the elder shaman's words returned to him. Seek out the throne of the elements. In his desperation, Gul'dan heeded those words. Quite how far Gul'dan travelled I cannot say with certainty, but if he was still in the wastes of Gorgrond when his cane broke, he would have moved from this region across the Tanaan jungle through the region of Talador and into the lands of Nagrand. If Gul'dan was not already on the edge of death, this journey to the throne of the elements would have certainly brought him close to expiration. This was Gul'dan's only opportunity for salvation. A pitiable Gul'dan brought himself before the elements, desperate to bring an end to his anguish. The elements took heed of Gul'dan's pleas and reached out to him. However, at the very last moment, the elemental furies withdrew their aid, sensing a darkness within the crippled orc's heart. As the furies backed away, Gul'dan greedily snatched at them in desperation. This forceful act was all the furies needed to confirm their suspicions about Gul'dan. The elemental forces dissipated, abandoning the orc. In the pounding rain, with only a loincloth to cover his body, the defeated, furious orc awaited his death. In the absence of the elements, another voice whispered to Gul'dan in his mind. The voice of the demon lord, Kil'Jaeden. Kil'Jaeden was a lieutenant of the Burning Legion, a demonic army that sought to purge the entire physical universe in flame. The voice offered an exchange for power beyond the orc's imagination if Gul'dan would become a harbinger of Kil'Jaeden's wrath. Gul'dan quickly took to the Demon Lord's teachings faster than Kil'Jaeden had originally thought, and with this, the first orcish warlock was born. You see, Kil'Jaeden had something specific in mind when he reached out to Gul'dan. This was not an attempt to aimlessly gather more followers for the Legion. During the year 200 BDP, the Draenei settled upon the Orcs' world of Draenor. This group had fled from the rest of their race, the Eredar, after the Eredar had agreed to join Sargeras, the leader of the Burning Legion, in exchange for the gift of power. Two of the three Eredar leaders, Archimonde and Kil'Jaeden, accepted Sargeras' gift, but the prophet Velen did not, and fled with those who would join him, renaming themselves the Draenei, meaning exiled ones. Kil'Jaeden, who had been very close to Velen, saw the prophet's flight as a very personal betrayal, and the Demon Lord became obsessed with exacting his vengeance upon the Draenei. But whenever Kil'Jaeden's forces found the Draenei, they took flight again before Kil'Jaeden's vengeance could be sated. On Draenor, Kil'Jaeden sought to be more subtle. He needed Gul'dan to unite the Orcish clans to have them finally destroy the Draenei. Before Velen became aware of the Orcs' newfound hostility toward them was the work of the Legion, it would already be too late. With this plan in mind, Kil'Jaeden made sure to teach Gul'dan how to conceal his fell powers as well. Now with a servant, Kil'Jaeden needed to devise a way to unite the Orc clans. The Demon Lord also needed the Orcs to be desperate, and their judgment to be clouded by dark emotions, so that their frustrations could be directed toward the Draenei. However, the student became the teacher, as Gul'dan was aware of a time in Orcish history when the clans had been united. Long ago, ogres had sought to dominate the power held within the Throne of the Elements. The ogres meddling through the elemental spirits into turmoil, affecting the very ecosystem of Draenor. And at that time, to prevent total destruction, the Orcs had banded together to defeat these ogres. Kil'Jaeden would have his servant recreate that elemental turmoil. Under his master's guidance, Gul'dan inundated the Throne of the Elements with fell energies, weakening the world's native spirits. This caused the elemental furies, Gordog, Arboreus, Calandrius, and Incineratus to materialize before Gul'dan. The warlock battered the furies with the power of the fell. Unaccustomed to this foul magic, the Furies buckled before the Warlock and were almost destroyed, fleeing before Gul'dan's wrath. Those who had rejected him previously had now been dominated by him, and Gul'dan found this dynamic intoxicating. Gul'dan's tampering sent the elemental spirits of Draenor into disarray. The usual passing of the seasons became unpredictable. Long periods of drought would be followed by devastating floods even in the most arid regions of the world. Rivers dried, and once tropical climates became blanketed with ice and snow. The Orcish shamans did their best to reach out to the elements to relieve their people of disease, thirst and hunger. but the tormented spirits did not heed the orcs' request for aid. As these events unfurled, the orcish clans met for one of their biannual Cho'Gall festivals. These Cho'Gall festivals saw many of the orc clans gather together so elders and chieftains could discuss matters of importance with those of other clans. Chieftain Ner'zhul of the Shadowmoon clan led the discussions at this Cho'Gall, focusing heavily on the elemental unrest and whether the orcs could do anything about it. As the orcs travelled home from this meeting, some began to exhibit strange symptoms, including the chieftain of the Frostwolf clan, Gul'dan. The Red Pox Disease saw disfiguring red sores form all over its victims' bodies and drained their strength. This disease was a mechanization of Gul'dan, created by his dark magic. To prevent this disease from spreading, Ner'zhul suggested the pox victims both remain in Gul'dan, the meeting place of the Cho'Gall, as well as isolate themselves from other orcs. Gul'dan agreed and helped construct a settlement for his fellow pox sufferers, before succumbing to the disease in a matter of weeks. With violence and desperation spreading among the orc clans, Kil'Jaeden sensed the time for their unification was almost at hand. But to unify the orcs, an inspirational public figure would be needed. Despite Gul'dan's undeniable magical talent, he was no leader. Gul'dan could not inspire those for whom he felt only disdain, but he would need to ally with someone that could. To serve his master absolutely and with no restrictions, Gul'dan needed to purge his past. Now in tattered robes, he returned to the village and brought himself before his old clan's chieftain. Incensed by the disgraced orc's boldness, the chieftain sneered at Gul'dan. He would never be allowed to rejoin his people. Gul'dan mulled over the chieftain's words and erupted with fury. He had no people. Gul'dan grasped the chieftain's head in his hands, and a sickly green light emanated from inside the chieftain's skull, escaping from his eye sockets, nostrils, and now agape mouth. Fell flame, the destructive magic of the Legion, which feeds on and destroys the souls of the living to harbour more destruction, engulfed and consumed the body of the chieftain. The village was powerless before the might of Gul'dan. None stood before him, and soon the entire village was wrapped in green flame. Among the burning wreckage, Gul'dan found the elderly shaman that had been the only one to show him kindness. The servant of demons sincerely thanked the shaman, for he had now found his destiny. Gul'dan then reduced the shaman to ash and claimed the elder's staff. With that, Gul'dan's past was erased, and no mortal would ever know his true origins. His past eradicated, Gul'dan made his way to the home of the Shadowmoon clan, for their shamans were respected throughout the Horde. Surely within this clan, one shaman could be made to serve as the perfect pawn of the Burning Legion. It was rare for orc clans to accept outsiders into their fold, but the Shadowmoon clan pitied the deformed warlock as he spun a tale of how his village had been destroyed, obliterated by marauding ogres. The Shadowmoon had no idea of the monumental power Gul'dan now wielded, as the warlock was careful to hide it throughout his search for an elder shaman whom he could deftly manipulate. Gul'dan's baleful eye fell upon the clan's chieftain, Ner'zhul. Ner'zhul was a dedicated and bold leader who, when he had a target, pursued it doggedly until the task was completed. He was perfect for Gul'dan's needs. But there was something else that also made Ner'zhul the perfect candidate. Years ago, the chieftain had been struck by tragedy when his mate, Rolkan, passed away. Previously, Ner'zhul was able to manage his grief by communing with the elements, but with them now in flux, he was unable to fill the hole that had been left by Rolkan's passing. Gul'dan was able to fake empathy, pretending he too had felt the sting of loss when his clan had been killed by ogres. Ner'zhul opened up to Gul'dan and came to view the outsider as a friend, even taking him on as his shamanistic apprentice. Now with access to a public figure, Kil'Jaeden set about subtly bending Ner'zhul's will to his own, and sent Gul'dan on another mission, to turn the Orcs against the Draenei. The Warlock focused his attention on the Bladewind clan. This clan's largest village lay on the outskirts of the Terokkar forest, near the Draenei's capital of Shattrath. For decades, tensions had simmered between the Bladewinds and the Draenei. The Orcs would occasionally ransack caravans and enslave the survivors. The Draenei answered these attacks with stronger caravan defences, though they never fought back too hard, as they did not wish to start a war with the Orcs. The elemental upheaval had badly affected the Bladewind clan. Their water sources were running dry, the game they hunted was dying off, and the Red Pox Disease had run rampant. Around 70% of the Bladewinds had succumbed to the disease. As Gul'dan had become a representative and shaman of the Shadowmoon clan, his words carried weight, and the Shadowmoon were generally respected by the other Orc clans due to their deep shamanistic history. Gul'dan convinced the Bladewinds that the Draenei were to blame for both the Red Pox and the world's elemental woes. Gul'dan told the Bladewind clan that if they spilt the blood of the Draenei, this would appease the elemental spirits, and order would be restored. The Bladewind heeded Gul'dan's words and, desperate to reverse their fortunes, began to assault Draenei caravans in even greater numbers, spilling the blood of those who were actually innocent. Gul'dan watched from afar as the Draenei's patience reached breaking point. The Draenei finally attacked the Bladewind settlement. Still determined to appease the elements, the Bladewind clan fought to the last, but were nearly all killed in the ensuing battle. Those that escaped the violence were murdered by Gul'dan as they fled. The Warlock made sure that only his tale of what happened here would survive. Upon returning to the Shadowmoon clan, Gul'dan gave his version of events. The brutish Draenei had attacked the Bladewinds utterly unprovoked and had slaughtered the clan, men, women and children alike. Word of the Draenei's ruthless aggression would spread throughout all the Orc clans. The seeds of distrust and hatred toward the Draenei had been sown. Kil'Jaeden had also been busy in Gul'dan's absence, appearing to Ner'zhul in dreams as his late partner Rolkan, and telling the shaman that it was the Draenei who were responsible for all the Orcs' woes. Ner'zhul was resistant at first. The Draenei had never been an overly violent people. Why would they seek to hurt the Orcs so much? But upon hearing Gul'dan's tale of what happened to the Bladewinds, Ner'zhul was convinced. He was now far more receptive to the urgings of Kil'Jaeden. The Demon Lord told the shaman that the Orcs must make war with the Draenei, but the clans had no hope of doing this as they were. They must unite. The demon was finally able to convince Ner'zhul that only he could save his people. No one else possessed the wisdom necessary. A determined and invigorated Ner'zhul told his clansmen of his intent to unite all the Orcish clans, and how the ancestral spirit of his mate had led him to this decision. Orcs deeply believe in the wisdom of their ancestors. The Shadowmoon voiced their support, and none more emphatically than Gul'dan. Ner'zhul sent an urgent summons to the other clans, who would meet under the shadow of Oshu'gun. What the Orcs thought was a smooth, white mountain was actually the ship that the Draenei had travelled to Draenor in. It was now a place the Orcs could easily commune with the spirits of their ancestors. Knowing this, Kil'Jaeden made sure to exert his power over Oshu'gun, making sure no Orcs would commune with an actual spirit of their ancestors. Weeks passed, and the Orcish chieftains gathered at Oshu'gun. When ready, Ner'zhul addressed the gathered throng. He told all the clans of Rolkan's prophetic warning. The Draenei had caused the elemental unrest, given them the Red Pox, and slaughtered the Bladewinds. And the Draenei would not stop until all Orcs were wiped out. Ner'zhul told the clans there was a way to avert disaster. if they united. Knowing most orc clans were quite solitary, Ner'zhul gave them a day to consider their position, so the true weight of the orcs' predicament could sink in. The debate over Ner'zhul's proposal raged into the night. Some more war-hungry clans were happy to unify, as they had become wary of the Draenei since the Blade Wind's obliteration. Others were unsure of what to do. The most vocal of these leaders was Chieftain Zaghrul of the Whiteclaw clan. He was sceptical that killing the Draenei would improve the orcs' situation, and even thought it could anger the elements further. Others also had their doubts, but were not nearly so vocal. The Draenei seemed kindly until now, but their orcish ancestors would not lie. Several shamans from other clans were also backing Ner'zhul's visions, saying they were visited by their own ancestors and told similar information. However, these were of course not true ancestors, but the mechanizations of Kil'Jaeden. As the debate went on, Gul'dan skulked around the gathered clan leaders. He knew other orcs perceived him as weak due to his physical deformities, and would use their false perception to his advantage. He would occasionally interject, championing Ner'zhul's call to war. This made the clan leaders think twice. If even this crippled orc was willing to fight and die for his people, why weren't they? Gul'dan made accepting the war a matter of honour. This manipulation swayed many to see the necessity for war, but Zargal and a few others remained firm in their beliefs. Gul'dan made sure to make note of who they were. But the warlock had done enough. When voting came at dawn, nearly every chieftain agreed to unite and fight the Draenei. From that day forth, the unified orc clans would be known as the Horde. The clans rallied their warriors and began their battle against the Draenei with sporadic attacks against Draenei hunting parties. The Draenei did their best to communicate with the orcs, trying to find out why their hostility toward them had escalated, but these calls for communication were either ignored or met with more open hostility. Once the Draenei had established that the orcs had united, they knew there would be no reasoning with them. War had arrived. However, the Draenei merely reinforced their holdings rather than fight back. They pitied the orcs. They did not know the orcs were pawns of the Burning Legion. The Draenei still saw the orcs as victims of the current elemental unrest, lashing out, confused, scared of what the future may hold. Ner'zhul watched the war with the Draenei unfold, and a sense of trepidation grew within him. Despite listening to the spirit of his beloved, no good was yet to come from the war. The orcs were developing a taste for shedding the blood of their enemies, but to the shaman's dismay, he could no longer hear the elemental spirits at all. They were utterly silent. Sensing Ner'zhul's doubts, Kil'Jaeden returned to his dreams as Rol'Kan. The false image of Rol'Kan told the anxious shaman that she could put him in contact with a powerful ally who could help the orcs defeat the Draenei and bring balance to the world. Obviously, Ner'zhul accepted this offer from his mates, and the next night, Kil'Jaeden appeared to Ner'zhul in the form of a radiant elemental entity. Ner'zhul was in awe of this new elemental benefactor, but as it spoke, his uneasiness returned. Kil'Jaeden told the shaman to press the orcish attack before the Draenei could fully muster their defences, and promised that if this was done, Ner'zhul would please the elements. The shaman picked up that this elemental spirit was all too eager to annihilate the Draenei, showing them no mercy. This new spirit was also obsessed with killing a particular Draenei, Velen. The shaman had never known an elemental to be so violent, and his suspicions were further raised. Since Kil'Jaeden's arrival into Ner'zhul's dreams, Rol'Kan had gone silent. Ner'zhul needed the guidance of his mate now more than ever. He headed off in secret to Oshu'gun to seek her advice. However, Kil'Jaeden was aware of Ner'zhul's plans. The shaman had not turned out to be the leader the Demon Lord had hoped for, and Kil'Jaeden turned once again to Gul'dan for assistance. He commanded Gul'dan to gather allies to help him control the Shadowmoon clan, as Ner'zhul could no longer be relied upon. Gul'dan started by meeting with a young, highly respected shaman of the clan, Gore. The frustrated shaman had been trying to commune with the elements for some time now, trying to invoke their aid against the Draenei in the ongoing war. Gul'dan introduced Gore to Fel magic, touting it as a higher form of shamanism. After witnessing the power of Fel magic firsthand, the young orc was convinced that this was the power that would give him the means to help his troubled race, and he willingly accepted Gul'dan's training in the art. Gul'dan did not stop there. He won more shaman to his side and trained them in the wonders of Fel magic too. While these shamans started learning this dark magic with the intention of aiding their people, the influx of Fel energy soon burned these noble intentions away. The corruptive power of Fel energy twisted their thoughts and darkened their hearts. They became loyal to Gul'dan alone. These were the first steps Gul'dan took towards establishing an organisation within the Horde that would guide many of its decisions in the future, the Shadow Council. While Gul'dan trained his new subordinates within the Shadowmoon clan, Ner'zhul had reached Oshu'gun. Ner'zhul's desire to seek guidance from his beloved Rolkan was so strong his will broke through the invisible barrier Kil'Jaeden had placed on the mountain to prevent the orcs from communing with their ancestors. Voices of the dead howled in Ner'zhul's mind, including that of the real Rolkan, no longer a deception created by Kil'Jaeden. Dismayed, she told Ner'zhul that he had been used. She said the Draenei were not the enemy, but that the demon who had sent the orcs against them surely was. Both Kil'Jaeden and Gul'dan sought to corrupt the orcs, and the Horde was a creation of their dark desires. Ner'zhul was left stunned. Not only had he been deceived and damned his people, but he had also been played for a fool by his apprentice Gul'dan from the very beginning. Ner'zhul had thought of Gul'dan as his friend and confidant until now. For Ner'zhul's part in this, the orcish ancestors turned their back on him. This crushed the elder shaman, and for a spiritual orc like himself, this was a fate worse than death. However, he could not blame them. He had helped sell out his people. He knew he would never win back the favour of the spirits. A dejected Ner'zhul, his heart heavy and head hung low, set off back towards Shadowmoon Valley. Though he may never be forgiven, Ner'zhul resolved that he would do his best to sabotage the plans of Kil'Jaeden and his servant Gul'dan. However, when the elder shaman returned home, he would not get a chance to hatch his plans, as he was immediately apprehended by Gul'dan and his new followers. Gul'dan's newly trained warlocks bayed for Ner'zhul's blood, but Gul'dan made sure to enact the punishment Kil'Jaeden had concocted. The Demon Lord wanted Ner'zhul alive so that he could witness the ultimate downfall of his race. He would not be granted the release of death, for Ner'zhul had betrayed Kil'Jaeden, an act which the Burning Legion did not take lightly. Leaving Ner'zhul alive but captive would also arouse less suspicion in the other orc clans. For if Ner'zhul, the one who had passionately lobbied for war, were to suddenly disappear, it would certainly seem odd to the others. For months, Ner'zhul was abused by Gul'dan and his lackeys and treated like a slave. Ner'zhul feared these beatings would lead to his demise and became increasingly timid as they went on. Eventually, Ner'zhul all but faded away from the public eye, and Gul'dan and his warlocks became the de facto voice of the Shadowmoon clan. While Gul'dan had been seizing control of the Shadowmoon clan, the orcs' war on the Draenei continued, rather unsuccessfully. They had crushed smaller outposts, but larger Draenei settlements remained beyond their reach, due to bickering among the clans. The Horde needed a leader, and Gul'dan yearned to take up that mantle. However, Kil'Jaeden knew that Gul'dan's strength did not lie in leadership, especially on the scale of leading the entire Horde. Gul'dan's strengths lay in manipulation and subterfuge. As a leader in the public eye, the warlock would not be able to play to his strengths. Kil'Jaeden told Gul'dan to find a new leader before the Horde crumbled. Gul'dan was furious that his master had not selected him, but still obliged the demon. If there was one thing the mighty warlock feared, it was enraging Kil'Jaeden. Gul'dan knew immediately who to select for the role: Chieftain Blackhand of the Blackrock clan. The Blackrock had military discipline and an elemental forge with which to craft weapons, two things that would massively benefit the other clans. Gul'dan travelled to meet with Blackhand and attempted to convince the blusterous leader to become war chief of the Horde. The warlock appealed to the warrior's pride and promised to make the Blackrock clan the mightiest clan in all of the Horde. Blackhand's shamans would no longer be impotent. They would wield otherworldly power, and the chieftain would be forever remembered as one of the greatest orc leaders to ever live. The warlock knew Blackhand would require examples of this power before he agreed to lead the Horde, so Gul'dan trained several shamans of the Blackrock clan in fel magic. He also taught these spellcasters how to magically increase the numbers of the Blackrock clan's armies. By flooding adolescent orcs with fel magic, Gul'dan showed the shaman they were able to speed up their development, growing rapidly and increasing their strength, creating more orcs that were of fighting age. The side effect was that the fel energy warped the young orcs' minds, making them susceptible to sudden outbursts of violence. Blackhand did not care about this and was extremely pleased with the results, so much so that he ordered his own sons, Dalrend and Maim, be transformed into proper soldiers with fel energy. Suitably impressed by Gul'dan's talents and seeing him as a valuable ally, Blackhand agreed to lead the Horde. To support his leadership, Gul'dan told Blackhand that he would create a secretive order to help him watch over the Horde and maintain control of the orcish forces. The Shadow Council was formed, welcoming Blackhand as one of its members. However, unbeknownst to the would-be war chief, Gul'dan was only including him as part of the Shadow Council to give Blackhand the impression that he had control of all aspects of the Horde. But Blackhand was no fool. He did not fully trust Gul'dan. Though the warlock hoped to make the war chief a puppet ruler, Blackhand sought to use Gul'dan to secure his place in orcish history. While Blackhand renewed his offence against the Draenei, Gul'dan formed the Shadow Council. The first members were the warlocks he had trained within the Shadowmoon clan. Others were soon introduced from other clans and all swore not to betray the council, as well as keep its existence and purpose a secret. Two of the council's most notable members, besides Gul'dan, Blackhand and Terran Gore, were Garona and Cho'Gall. Garona was a half-orc Draenei and perhaps the only survivor of the massacred Bladewind clan. Garona was a skilled fighter and able to speak the Draenei language, and she stumbled across the Shadow Council during her travels. Gul'dan saw potential in the young half-orc and won her over. He was able to empathise because, as a half-breed, Garona's early life was filled with abuse, much like Gul'dan's. When Garona let her guard down and trusted him, Gul'dan betrayed her. The Shadow Council ensorcelled the young half-orc and put her to work as the Shadow Council's assassin. Cho'Gall was a two-headed ogre who once resided in the ogre city of Maul. However, the ogre aristocracy felt threatened by his popularity and tried to have him assassinated. Gul'dan was intrigued by the ogre's drive and took him on as his foremost apprentice. Cho'Gall joined the Shadow Council in hopes of gaining more power to enact his vengeance. Around this time, Gul'dan also formed another group of orcs with the help of Kil'Jaeden, called the Necrolites. These orcs specialised in the art of necromancy. Their spells were capable of spreading disease and plague through the Draenei ranks, as well as raising the dead to fight alongside the Horde. With the Shadow Council now fully formed, Blackhand could ascend to the rank of War Chief. Gul'dan knew the other headstrong orcish clans would not yet be willing to accept Blackhand as War Chief of the Horde, so he sent out his agents in the Shadow Council across the clans. The agents dedicated their time to spreading stories of Black Hand's mighty deeds, including how his shamans had discovered a new power, even greater than that of the elements. While they spellbound many orcs with their tales, the Council's agents also spied on the other clans, relaying this information back to Gul'dan. One orc in particular drew the warlock's ire, much as he had during the forming of the Horde at Cho'Gall, Zagrel of the Whiteclaw clan. However, this time Gul'dan could act on Zagrel's insolence. Zagrel was looking to end the orcs' pointless war and return to honouring the elements, so that they would once again heed the calls of the orcish shamans. But Gul'dan sent out Garona, who deftly assassinated the chieftain. Zagrel's death was suspicious given his opposition to the war, but there was no trace as to who had murdered him. With the war's biggest detractor now dead and Black Hand's popularity on the rise, Gul'dan called a meeting of the clans at Cho'Gall. Gul'dan had one final ace up his sleeve to further convince the other orcs that Black Hand was the right choice to lead them. For too long, the shaman of the other clans had been powerless. Gul'dan presented the Black Rock Warlocks. The spellcasters showed off the powers they now wielded. Eager not to feel so weak, the shaman of the other clans were in awe of the warlock's abilities, and they all clamoured to be taught Fel magic. Gul'dan told them that this magic had been taught to the Black Rocks by benevolent beings that sought the Draenei's demise. He never mentioned demons or the Burning Legion. That was information only for his most trusted Shadow Council brethren, like Cho'Gall. With the shaman all now empowered by Fel magic, Gul'dan once again addressed the clans. Despite this new power given to them, the orcs would still struggle to defeat the Draenei. The orcs would need to organise and strike as one. They would need a single leader to command them, and who better for that role than Black Hand, winner of numerous victories and whose warlocks were the masters of Fel magic. The vote was unanimously in favour of Black Hand. Some hoped this would see the power of their clans grow, while others did not wish to stand against Black Hand out of fear of the repercussions. Black Hand set about uniting the clans, creating a mighty stronghold in the western region of the Tanaan jungle, called the Citadel. Here orcs could discuss battle tactics and warlocks could train. The Citadel also acted as the new headquarters for the Shadow Council, though those outside the Order were none the wiser. Members would slink around the stronghold, reporting all they saw to Gul'dan. The new war chief won over the other clans with favours and threats of violence. The Black Rock clan gifted great weapons to the other clans, and Black Hand further bolstered the Horde's armies by accepting ogres and Mok Nathal, half-orc, half-ogres, into the fold, and using his warlocks to magically age adolescent orcs. With the rampant use of Fel magic within their ranks, this was around the time that the brown skin of the orcs began to change to a deep green. While the Horde flourished, rumours reached Gul'dan's ears of subterranean orcs beneath the region of Nagrand, called the Pale. Gul'dan was relatively disinterested in the Pale, but was instructed by Kil'Jaeden to seek these orcs out, for they wielded a magic that rivaled the potency of Fel, the power of the Void, or shadow magic. At his master's urging, Gul'dan had Cho'Gall investigate the Pale. The Ogre found the Pale oddly accommodating, as the orcs told the Ogre of visions they had witnessed of the hour of twilight, the end of all existence. The Ogre used this to his advantage, convincing the Pale that the Horde were a vehicle to achieve the hour of twilight. The Pale joined the Horde as a new clan, the Twilight Hammer clan. The Horde won victory after victory over the Draenei. It became clear to the Draenei that the orcs were being influenced by the Burning Legion. They had warlocks, and the overuse of Fel magic was also taking its toll on Draenor. Forests were dying, streams and rivers were drying up and becoming polluted by the foul energies. The Draenei chose to focus their efforts on defending their two largest cities, Shattrath and Karabor. It was not only the Draenei who now recognised the destructive effect of the Orcs' fel magics on Draenor, the world's elemental spirits had noticed too. In response, they pooled their dwindling power and fused into a single mighty being. Cyruk, the Fire Lord. This being sought to end the Horde once and for all. Eager to deal a debilitating blow to the Draenei, the Horde made toward Karabor. On the eve of their attack, the Orcs set up camp near a volcano in the region of Shadowmoon Valley. Without warning, the volcano erupted with fire and Cyruk took form in the heart of the volcano. The enraged elemental spirit battered the Horde with roaring firestorms, causing the Orcs to flee in fear and causing Warlocks to realise their embracing of fel magics had angered the elements they had once so revered. But in this tragedy, Gul'dan saw opportunity. The elements had exposed themselves, and now the leader of the Shadow Council could prove beyond any doubt that fel magic was greater than the elementals, sever the Orcs' connection to the elementals, and claim their power to bolster his own. Gul'dan gathered his Shadow Council faithful at the bottom of the volcano's slopes, and together they flooded Cyruk with fel energy. This shattered the elemental's physical form. The mountain roared in protest and chasms yawned open in the immediate area. Fel and elemental energy spilled forth from them. Gul'dan directed his warlocks, using these energies to infuse the Orcs with further strength. Gul'dan had succeeded in making the Horde yet more powerful and in severing the Orcs' connection to the elements. The volcano, now spewing fel energy, would be known as the Hand of Gul'dan from this day forth. A now even stronger Horde stormed the city of Karabor. The desperate Draenei were able to hold the Orcs at a stalemate for some time, but Gul'dan found a way to break them. The Dark Star drifted above Shadowmoon Valley. The Orcs had no idea, but this star was actually a being, a drifting Naru, Kara. The Naru had helped the Draenei avoid the Legion initially, and their spaceships had carried the Draenei to safety, a few Naru accompanying the wayward wanderers. Naru in life have an innate bond with the light, one of the universe's two primordial forces. However, when grievously wounded, a Naru enters a void state and radiates void energy, the opposite primordial force. Gul'dan guided his Shadow Council brethren in a ritual to draw off the devouring void energy from the Dark Star. As a result, a pillar of void energy struck down from the heavens into the very centre of Karabor. Many Draenei died instantly, while others were driven mad by the dark energies as the shadows spread over the city. A handful of Draenei escaped, but those that remained were delivered agonising deaths by the Orcs that tore through their city after. The void energies darkened the surrounding area, and from that day, Karabor would be known as the Black Temple. Gul'dan immediately claimed the Black Temple as his own. Publicly, he told the Orcs the temple would be used as a location to hold Draenei captives, where a select group of warlocks could interrogate them for information. In actuality, this would be the new base of operations for the Shadow Council. Gul'dan was able to convince Blackhand to let his clandestine order move from the Citadel by telling the War Chief that this would allow the Shadow Council to remain hidden from the rest of the Horde. In reality, Gul'dan wanted to distance himself from the ever-watchful eye of Blackhand. What Gul'dan said publicly was not too far from the truth though. He and the Shadow Council immediately set about brutally torturing captive Draenei, doing all they could to learn about the city of Shattrath and its defences. It became clear that Shattrath was even better fortified than Karabor, and would be far harder to conquer. It would be the greatest challenge the Horde had come up against so far. Gul'dan would not be able to harness the power of the Dark Star to destroy Shattrath. He and the Horde would need further assistance. Luckily for Gul'dan, his master Kil'Jaeden had a plan. Empowering the orcs through fell energy was an effective but limited method. The orcs had become strong, but by drinking the blood of a demon, they would become even stronger. Not only would this method infuse the orcs with yet more fell power, but their demonic corruption would be complete, and the race would forever be shackled to the will of the Burning Legion. Gul'dan was more than willing to help Kil'Jaeden to convince his fellow orcs to drink the demon blood. To the warlock, damning his entire race was a small price to pay for the godlike power that had been promised to him by Kil'Jaeden. The head of the Shadow Council convinced Black Hand to gather the Horde together atop mountains located near the Citadel, telling the war chief he had found a way to further utilise the power of fell magic, making sure not to tell Black Hand of the power's source. Black Hand sent out the order for the clans to gather, and as they all journeyed to the single meeting point, Gul'dan and Kil'Jaeden began their preparations. Kil'Jaeden was able to open the temporary gateway to the Black Temple, and through it stepped Mannoroth, the Destructor. Not much struck fear into Gul'dan, but the presence of this giant, imposing, powerful demon made even him quake somewhat. Gul'dan made sure to keep Mannoroth's arrival a secret, only few of his most trusted Shadow Council members knowing of Mannoroth's existence. But the Shadow Council was somewhat sloppy. Ner'zhul found out what they planned. The council had long assumed Ner'zhul was broken. They kept the old chieftain of the Shadow Moon around so that he could witness every inch of the Horde's gradual corruption, the Elder Shaman wallowing in his own self-loathing for helping damn his people. But Ner'zhul was not as broken as the council assumed. The beaten orc had enough defiance left in him to warn the one chieftain he thought would listen to him to not drink the blood of Mannoroth when the time came. Cho'Gall of the Frostwolf clan. Ner'zhul's communication went unnoticed by the Shadow Council. Several days later, atop the mountain, Gul'dan addressed the gathered clans and revealed to them the font of Mannoroth's green, steaming, bubbling blood. Gul'dan did not reveal the liquid's true source, but informed his race that this had been a gift from the benevolent beings that had taught the orcs fell magic in the first place. They now wished to bestow another gift upon the orcs, which would grant them power akin to gods. Gul'dan invited the chieftains to step forward and accept this gift. The first and most eager was Grommash Hellscream, chieftain of the Warsong clan. The barbarous warrior drank deeply of Mannoroth's blood, while the other orcs watched on with interest. The blood caused Grommash to grow taller, his muscles bulged, and fell power flooded through his veins. The chieftain's eyes now glowed bright with red light. Grommash let out a mighty war cry, eager to spill Draenei blood. Having witnessed the power, most orcs clamoured to drink from the font, bar a few. Black Hand's second, Orgrim Doomhammer, did not drink, insisting he was not worthy of drinking from the same cup as Black Hand. He was but a servant of his war chief. Reasoning Black Hand and Gul'dan were happy to accept, though Orgrim had in fact become suspicious of Gul'dan and his actions. Gul'dan was less forgiving of Cho'Gall when the chieftain refused to drink and forbid his clan from drinking too. Ner'zhul's missive, which the Elder Shaman had sent anonymously to Cho'Gall, had confirmed the chieftain's suspicions, that all was not as it seemed. For some time Cho'Gall had been doubting the legitimacy of the orcs' war upon the Draenei. His previous doubts had not gone unnoticed by Gul'dan, and the warlock was fast losing his patience with the young upstart chieftain. This act of defiance only served to infuriate Gul'dan further. He even wondered if the chieftain had been able to learn of the Burning Legion. However, Gul'dan would not be able to deal with Cho'Gall now. If he killed the chieftain, it risked upsetting the Frostwolves on the eve of their assault on Shattrath, a large and essential clan for the attack. Gul'dan would have to wait. Those that defied him would always pay for their actions sooner or later. The orcs that had drank revelled in the new power they had been granted. Their bodies had been twisted to support a more powerful frame, and their confidence was bolstered. All fear and hesitation faded from their minds. They were a force that had no equal. Their bodies now radiated fel energy, so much so that it even affected the few orcs around them who had not drunk the blood. Soon, all orcs had been corrupted by the demon blood enough that they all sported completely green skin. A newfound bloodlust awoke in those who drank Manoros blood. They beat their chests and called for the death of the Draenei, a request Blackhand was more than happy to fulfill, and that night he led the orcs in a march towards Shattrath. As the orcs set out, Gul'dan chose to boost their morale yet further. He pumped the mountain, now at their backs, full of fel energy, causing gouts of green fire to erupt from the ground. Gul'dan heralded this impressive display as a good omen, much like the volcano that had erupted before their victory at Karabor. The trembling mountain filled the orcs with unbridled courage, convinced that this was a sign of their impending victory. This mountain would come to be called the Throne of Kil'Jaeden. As the Horde approached Shattrath, they were beset by Draenei scouting parties, but this did little to slow their approach. With Shattrath in the distance, Kil'Jaeden appeared before the Horde and revealed himself as their benefactor. Now with the orcs bound to the will of the Legion, there was no longer a need for deception. Kil'Jaeden brought more gifts to the orcs, teaching the warlocks further spellwork that would drive fear into the heart of their enemies. Gul'dan and his Shadow Council had also been working on a weapon to help the Horde's victory. They had melded their magics with the Red Pox Disease strain, creating an even more devastating chemical weapon which would spread disease throughout the Draenei ranks. Crude bombs filled with this mixture were loaded onto siege engines and flung against the walls of Shattrath. This covered the city in a red mist, which caused the Draenei's skin to burn and for them to struggle for air. It also masked the orcs' advance. The Draenei fought with ferocity, making this the Horde's costliest battle yet, but the orcs were unstoppable. The mist hungrily spread throughout the city. Warlocks summoned stone constructs called infernals from the sky after being taught by Kil'Jaeden, and the streets ran thick with Draenei blood. The Horde were emphatically victorious. Despite their victory though, Gul'dan was worried. Velen, the Draenei Kil'Jaeden had wanted dead above all others, was not accounted for. Gul'dan had not yet been contacted by his master after the Draenei defeat and wanted to make sure Velen was dead before contact. Gul'dan sent Garona to find and kill the Draenei, but despite years of searching, the competent tracker Garona was unable to find Velen. While Gul'dan was worrying himself with this, he was also aware of another perturbing development. The few Draenei soldiers that had survived had made their way to the Auchindoun, a holy site, a city that entombed many Draenei. They could not bear to see it fall to the Horde. Gul'dan was concerned the Draenei would invoke the spirits of their ancestors to aid against the Horde, so he sent Terran-Gor to deal with them. Terran-Gor was narrowly successful, and the spellwork he and his fellow Shadow Council agents wrought decimated the lush forests surrounding the Tomb City. This grey, lifeless land became known as the Bone Wastes. With the Draenei defeated, the Horde began the process of bringing all Draenor to heel, a process that was particularly gratifying for Gul'dan's apprentice Cho'Gall, as he finally achieved his vengeance against the Ogres who had tried to assassinate him. The giant city of Maul was one of the few pockets of Ogres who had not joined the Horde. Almost all Draenor's other races were put to the sword to ensure the Orcs' dominance. However, as the Orcs dominated Draenor, they were taking control of a dying world. Fel magics had made the world near barren, wiping many signs of life away. The Orcs destroyed life energy so that they could create their destructive spells. Blackhand became worried. His soldiers would need water to survive, and rivers were starting to dry up, and food was becoming scarce. He turned to Gul'dan and demanded to know what Kil'Jaeden had planned for them next. Surely the Demon Lord had foreseen this and could propose a solution. Gul'dan hid the truth from Blackhand. Kil'Jaeden had not contacted him after Shattrath. This had happened very suddenly and without warning, a source of endless frustration for Gul'dan. He had been promised godhood in exchange for the destruction of the Draenei, and this had not been granted to him. Bitterness and anger festered within Gul'dan, wondering if Kil'Jaeden had used the orcs and, more importantly, him as a pawn. Gul'dan knew Black Hand would likely have him killed without his connection to Kil'Jaeden, so the warlock told the war chief to be patient, and Kil'Jaeden would reveal their path. The silence would last nearly a full year, and the Horde gradually started to devour itself, the demonic bloodlust still burning in their veins. When there were no others to fight, they ended up fighting each other. Some clans, including Grommash Hellscream's Warsong, fully lost themselves to their maddening bloodlust and as a result were banished from the Horde, these violent clans fighting amongst each other. As time went by, Gul'dan became more and more afraid for his life. He knew the mighty Black Hand would have limits to his patience, and the warlock was yet to reveal the Horde's salvation. The Horde were becoming desperate. Then, in the year 1 BDP, a hooded stranger appeared before Gul'dan and his Shadow Council. Gul'dan was incensed that this stranger dare show up unannounced in his lair and lashed out with the full power of his fell magics. However, the figure was not blown apart. They were able to turn Gul'dan's power back on him, causing the orc to writhe in agony. Gul'dan's pride had been severely wounded. Not only had he been bested, but he had been so in his own realm and been made to kneel in front of the person who had defeated him in full view of his Shadow Council peers. This was an insult Gul'dan would never forget or forgive. Despite clearly seeing the orc had been greatly angered by his actions, the stranger spoke to him. He told Gul'dan that the time for the orcs to escape Draenor had come, and in order to do this, they would need to construct a giant magical portal to take them to a far-off world called Azeroth. Visions of this world were shown to Gul'dan and the Shadow Council. Lush rolling landscapes, brimming with game and dotted with pristine lakes and rivers. This world was ripe for the Horde to conquer. Calmed somewhat, Gul'dan assessed the stranger in front of him, and could sense something demonic within the hooded figure. The astute orcs surmised that this stranger was a servant of the Burning Legion's master, Sargeras. This would also explain Kil'Jaeden's silence. They had been prepping another messenger to redirect the power of the Horde. Gul'dan was correct. This was Medivh, the guardian of Azeroth, sworn to defend the world from demons, but from birth he had been possessed by Sargeras. The guardian had approached the Horde thinking this would be how he would save Azeroth, but he was being played by Sargeras. Even with accurately guessing Medivh was an agent of the mighty Sargeras and with his people on the edge of ruin, Gul'dan did nothing for free. He bargained with Medivh. He wanted to know what he would receive for filling his part in the invasion of Azeroth. Gul'dan always wanted power, so Medivh flashed another vision within the warlock's mind. Gul'dan saw underwater ruins known by few on Azeroth, called the Tomb of Sargeras. This was not where the body of Sargeras lay, but the broken husk of an avatar containing a portion of his power, which had been defeated by a guardian of Azeroth. While only containing a small fragment of Sargeras' power, it was still otherworldly, and this was enough to tempt Gul'dan. Medivh told the orc if his people conquered Azeroth, he would reveal the tomb's location to Gul'dan. Given his circumstances, Gul'dan chose to trust the stranger's word, and told Black Hand he had found a new world for their people to conquer, and what would be required to reach Azeroth. Black Hand, again with little choice, was happy to support Gul'dan in his efforts to construct the portal Medivh had said would be required. Gul'dan searched for an area where the magical ley lines of Draenor converged. He settled on a location within the eastern reaches of Hellfire Peninsula. This was the new name for Tanaan Jungle, when all the trees had died and the soil had become barren and red. Once the location was picked, Black Hand commanded the orcs to begin building the giant enchanted stone frame that would help support and sustain the portal once it was summoned. The giant gateway would become known as the Dark Portal. As the portal continued to take shape, Gul'dan urged Black Hand to strengthen the clans. It had been a long time since the Horde had been required to battle an opponent. The once sharp blade had become dull. Black Hand staged mock battles and duels between the clans, allowing them to become accustomed to battle again and stoking their bloodlust. As the orcs revelled in combat, Gul'dan looked upon his people and was dismayed by what they had become. He began to speak out against Gul'dan and the use of fel magic. It had clearly led the orcs down a desperate and dark path. Gul'dan urged his people to focus on healing their world. However, Gul'dan's words were seen as an act of treason and cowardice. Only scorn was thrown the way of the Frostwolves. Nonetheless, Gul'dan kept a close eye on Gul'dan. He could not have him disrupt the Horde's focus. A majority of orcs, especially those who had drunk the demon blood, were excited by the prospect of battle again, so it was easy to keep them on task. They could see their world was dying, and they saw the chance to conquer a new world as something they must seize while they could. With the Dark Portal's stone construct complete, Gul'dan communed with Medivh. It would take both the Warlock and the Guardian's huge power to open a portal of this scale, traversing such a great distance. Even then, it would not be enough. Gul'dan requested that nearly all surviving Draenei prisoners be brought to the base of the portal. At the moment Gul'dan and Medivh began their rituals in tandem to open the portal, Gul'dan instantly drained all the life energy from every prisoner, giving his spellwork the extra jolt needed to tear a rift in the fabric of reality. The shimmering portal yawned open, filling the arch of the stone structure that surrounded it. For the first time, the Horde laid their eyes upon Azeroth. The Warchief's most trusted scouts made their way through the Dark Portal, along with several Warlocks. They crossed over into an isolated swamp in Azeroth known as the Black Morass. They set up camp, and the Warlocks oversaw the construction of a second enchanted stone frame to stabilise the gateway and allow it to stay open for a prolonged period. As this was being built, the Orcs took the time to scout out more of Azeroth, and Gul'dan made sure to put his spy Garona to good use. When she had not found Medivh on her first crossing to Azeroth, an irritated Gul'dan, who wanted to know exactly who or what Medivh was, allowed the assassin free rein to investigate the new world. Garona was able to learn a few words of the human language from hunters the orcs had captured to ensure their existence was not yet revealed. One human ranted and raved about a powerful mage that would wipe the orcs from the face of the earth. Amongst the man's furious ravings, Garona was able to locate the home of Medivh, the Tower of Karazhan. Despite her aptitude for stealth, Medivh caught Garona almost as soon as she set foot in his domain. Medivh spared the assassin's life. She was a curiosity to him. He'd never seen a half Draenei, half Orc, and was impressed by how intelligent she was, having learnt human phrases so quickly. Due to Gul'dan's endless cruelty to her, Garona had no true loyalty to the Horde. Medivh decided to befriend her, as having an ally within the Horde would benefit him. The mage genuinely liked Garona, as he saw a bit of himself in her, an outsider. Due to his power, Medivh struggled to make genuine connections. He told Garona she could visit his lonely home Karazhan at any time. Garona returned and reported back what she had learnt to Gul'dan. While Garona had sensed the darkness deep within Medivh, she had not recognised him as the hooded stranger, never having met him previously. Gul'dan did. Since Gul'dan had such a strong control over Garona's mind, she had not needed to report to him. He'd seen the whole thing through her eyes. Gul'dan was at the same time disappointed and furious. Medivh was only human. He had expected more. A demon, or perhaps a commander of the Legion in disguise. This meant the powerful warlock had been bested by a mere mortal. Gul'dan decided once Medivh's usefulness was at an end, the tomb of Sargeras' location revealed, he would make sure to kill Medivh himself. Gul'dan ordered Garona to go back to Medivh and learn what she could. Eventually, the humans of the Kingdom of Stormwind discovered the orcs. While the humans seemed to get the better of the orcs to begin with, fighting in familiar territory, the small force that was dispatched eventually had to retreat. For every orc they killed, 2 more seemed to take their place, as they continued to stream into Azeroth through the Dark Portal. Stormwind began to ready itself for full-scale war. As more clans continued to cross over into Azeroth, the Horde amassing their mighty fighting force, one chieftain in particular was beginning to wear Gul'dan's patience thin. For the past year or so, Durotan had not let up on criticising the Orcish leadership, including Gul'dan and his use of fel magic. Durotan saw the Horde as a shadow of the noble people they once were, with rich ties to the elements. However, despite his disgust for the Horde's leadership, Durotan brought his clan through the portal. There was nothing left for them on Draenor. Only by going to Azeroth could his clan survive another generation. Gul'dan needed a unified Horde, and the Frostwolves did not fit in with that vision. He could not kill Durotan. If he did, the chieftain would become a martyr, and orcs may begin to turn from the Horde. So, the warlock confronted the chieftain in secret. Gul'dan banished the Frostwolves from the Horde and told Durotan if he or any of his clan even so much as tried to contact any member of the Horde, he promised to destroy every member of the clan, down to the youngest infant. Durotan, his wife Draka, pregnant at the time, did not wish to risk incurring Gul'dan's wrath, and took his clan to the north, away from the Horde. With the Frostwolves gone, the Horde's mission of conquest began in earnest. For around a year, Gul'dan was happy to sit back and leave the capable Black Hand to lead the Horde's offensive. The chieftain made effective decisions in the Horde's war against Stormwind. While some Horde had initially tried to conquer other areas of Azeroth, he had refocused them, directing their might towards Stormwind. Around this time, Gul'dan's second Cho'Gall was given the leadership of the Twilight Hammer clan, in order to bring them in line. Members of Gul'dan's Shadow Council ended up assassinating Durotan and Draka. The two reached out to Blackhand's second, Orgrim Doomhammer, and met with him, telling him that they suspected Gul'dan worked with some dark power. The fact their son was born with green skin showed the orcs' corruption was now in the blood of new generations, which prompted the couple to seek out Doomhammer. Doomhammer was good friends with Durotan, and had been disgusted with the leadership when the Frostwolves were banished. Durotan and Draka's theories and child confirmed some of Doomhammer's own suspicions about the corruptive influence of fel magic. The friends agreed to work together to liberate the Horde, but they would need to wait for the right moment to strike. Doomhammer sent his guards along with Durotan, Draka and their son Gul'dan to grant them safe passage to the north. However, these 3 loyal guards were actually loyal to the Shadow Council. The guards murdered Draka and Durotan, one of them losing their life in the ensuing fray, and left the couple's son to die out in the wilderness. Gul'dan would never learn of this, as Orgrim became suspicious his guards never returned. He sent more men who discovered the bodies and hunted down the remaining Shadow Council loyalists, and put them to the sword. A couple more years passed, and the relations between Gul'dan and Blackhand began to fray somewhat. Blackhand led a small raiding party into the region of Redridge, looking to conquer the township of Lakeshire. His forces were ambushed and slaughtered. The war chief may have also lost his life that day if not for the intervention of 2 Shadow Council warlocks that were flanking him. Their fel magics were able to push the humans back. The Horde would later return en masse and claim Lakeshire. However, Blackhand had little gratitude toward the warlocks that had saved his life. This ambush had bruised his pride, and he blamed the warlocks for not sensing the ambush before it happened. As a result, he had them executed for incompetence. Gul'dan was not too pleased with Black Hand's actions. The Warchief may command the Horde, but the Warlocks were his subordinates to discipline. The Shadow Council's agents were finite. Black Hand's injured pride had removed a vital resource from Gul'dan. Black Hand cared little for Gul'dan's irritation. As Warchief, he would not be questioned. The human ambush had given Gul'dan pause for thought. Despite the orcs outnumbering them, the humans had slaughtered nearly all of them. They were clearly a resourceful race, and sieging their capital Stormwind would likely be the greatest task the Horde had ever been faced with. Fighting the Draenei had been different. The Horde was at full strength. The clans that had been driven mad by their bloodlust had remained behind on Draenor. Black Hand figured they would be too hard to control. Years of war and famine back on Draenor had taken its toll upon the Horde's clans that had crossed over. There was also Medivh. Gul'dan had come to learn that Medivh in the year 18 BDP had defended the city of Stormwind from a seemingly impossible situation. The mighty Gurubashi troll tribe descended upon the city of Stormwind. Their siege seemed unbreakable, but Medivh called upon his great power, freezing trolls in their tracks, burning them from the inside out, and blasting them with arcane force. The mighty Gurubashi troll empire became a shadow of what it once was. Gul'dan had also gathered fragments of knowledge about the lineage Medivh belonged to, the Guardians. A council of mages focused their power into one individual, the Guardian. This was to make the mage powerful enough to fight demons. They dedicated themselves to protecting humanity. Sure, Medivh had summoned the Horde to Azeroth, but Gul'dan still had no idea why. Was the human sincere in wanting the Horde to conquer Azeroth? Was he truly a puppet of the Burning Legion? Or was Medivh only in league with himself, with some other ulterior motive? Either way, Gul'dan was unsure whether he would all of a sudden turn on the Horde. Gul'dan sought to empower the Horde as he had once before on Draenor, by corrupting the elemental spirits of Azeroth, which were even more powerful than those on Draenor. Shadow Council spies reported sensing massive elemental activity in a volcano near the region of Red Ridge, called Blackrock Mountain, reports that were confirmed by Cho'Gall. Shadow Council agents travelled to the mountain intending to subjugate the fire elementals located within. It was a disaster. These elementals were servants of the elemental lord, Ragnaros, and far more powerful than any elemental force the orcs had encountered before. The first Shadow Council agents that tried to subjugate them were burned from the inside out. The elemental forces were also backed by the Dark Iron Dwarves who had been enslaved by the Fire Lord. Wherever the Warlocks tried to trespass, the Dwarves found them. Things were looking grim for the Shadow Council. They risked inciting Ragnaros' forces into all-out war. However, Cho'Gall said he would negotiate with the elementals and headed into the mountain alone. What exactly happened is Cho'Gall's story, not Gul'dan's, but the Ogre returned successful. The elementals even granted a small refuge for the council within Blackrock Mountain, called the Blackrock Spire. While Gul'dan was disappointed he had failed in his original intent, he had gained a lot. He had discovered Cho'Gall's ability as a diplomat and had a new secret location for the Shadow Council, giving him some distance from Black Hand. Dominating the mountain would have to wait for another time. Black Hand had scoffed when Gul'dan told him his mission to Blackrock was a failure. He did not need the power of the elementals. He was ready to attack Stormwind with the regions Brightwood, Westfall and Red Ridge now under Horde control. However, this initial siege was catastrophic, and the Horde suffered heavy casualties. They would need to retreat and replan their assault. Gul'dan knew exactly why Stormwind had been prepared for the orcs. Garona had been leaking the Horde's battle plans to Khadgar, the apprentice of Medivh, during her trips to Karazhan. Gul'dan knew each time Garona went to Karazhan, she revealed yet more about Orcish culture and their plans to her new human friends. However, the details Gul'dan was learning about Medivh and his strange home were far too valuable to him, even worth risking the Orcish war effort. However, it was not much longer until Garona and Khadgar discovered that it was Medivh that had brought the Horde to Azeroth. They fled Karazhan and headed for Stormwind, demanding an audience with Kil'Jaeden. Khadgar vouched for Garona as the Stormwind guards were naturally suspicious of her. Gul'dan was able to see through Garona's eyes, and was able to see she was before Stormwind's ruler. He tried to compel Garona to kill Lane, but she was able to resist these dark suggestions. Upon hearing Khadgar and Garona's story, Lane knew Medivh must be stopped. The Guardian posed an even greater threat than the Horde. A force including Garona and Khadgar stormed Medivh's sanctuary. Gul'dan panicked. He could not afford Medivh to die. He still had no idea where the tomb of Sargeras was. As the battle commenced, Gul'dan reached out to the Guardian's mind. Despite being assaulted, Medivh was able to keep up his mental defences, but as the battle intensified and demanded more of his attention, he needed to let these defences down, allowing Gul'dan in. The Warlock rummaged frantically through Medivh's mind, trying to find the tomb's location. During the battle, Medivh mentally assaulted Garona and magically aged Khadgar, but eventually Khadgar was able to drive a sword through the demon-corrupted Guardian, delivering a mortal blow. Gul'dan had discovered what he needed to, the tomb's location. However, at the time of Medivh's death, he was still rummaging in the Guardian's mind for information. The shock of the Guardian's death slammed into Gul'dan's mind and sent the leader of the Shadow Council into a deep coma. Gul'dan lay in his coma for weeks in a cot with thick fur wrapping his body. Cho'Gall stood over his master a majority of the time, and the Ogre was present as Gul'dan sat bolt upright, gasping for air. The Orc demanded to know where he was. A pleasantly surprised Cho'Gall explained he had been asleep for some time, while ensuring his master was drinking water to rehydrate him. The two-headed Ogre confessed to Gul'dan many had thought he may die. With a wicked grin, Gul'dan said, "Do you now? Were you afraid I would leave you, Cho'Gall? Abandon you to Black Hand's tender mercies?" It was now the Orc's turn to be surprised. "Black Hand is dead," said Cho'Gall. But before the Ogre had a chance to explain, 4 Orcs barged their way into Gul'dan's tent. Upon seeing the Warlock awake, 2 of the Orcs strode up to him and manhandled Gul'dan out of the tent. The Warlock was far too drained to defend himself with magic, and he would have lacked the physical strength to break away from these Orcs either way. Gul'dan was thrown at the feet of Black Hand's replacement. Once the old war chief's second, Orgrim Doomhammer, now led the Horde. With Gul'dan unconscious and Black Hand still scattered from his failed siege on Stormwind, Doomhammer saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike and begin the process of restoring the Horde's honour. He challenged Black Hand to Muck Gorah, a traditional Orcish duel to the death that, if refused, would cause great dishonour. After defeating Black Hand, Doomhammer knew there was no going back for the Horde. They still had a war to win, and he led a successful siege of Stormwind, claiming it for the Horde. This victory was partly thanks to Gul'dan. During the siege, Garona sought an audience with Kil'Jaeden, which the king granted. However, being rattled by the fight with Medivh, Gul'dan's earlier command to kill the king returned to Garona's mind, and this time she could not resist what she was being commanded to do. She slew the king, tears streaming down her face as she desperately tried to resist. And without their wise ruler, Stormwind fell. Victorious, Doomhammer began the process of purging the darkness that had infected the Horde. He was able to find where the Shadow Council hid and butchered a majority of the Order, leaving only the unconscious Gul'dan, Cho'Gall, and a handful of neophytes that Doomhammer promptly had chained. Realising the near hopelessness of his situation, Gul'dan began to cower before the mighty Doomhammer. The power he had once held over the Horde was completely gone, and Doomhammer was clearly set on taking the Warlock's life. Before Orgrim's mighty hammer connected with Gul'dan's skull, the now helpless Orc begged for his life. Somewhat shocked and amused by seeing the mighty Gul'dan beg, Ogre allowed him to speak. Despite a burning hatred seething within Gul'dan, he kept control of his emotions. He knew Doomhammer would look at any excuse to spill his blood. The Warlock pledged loyalty to Doomhammer, disavowing his masters in the Burning Legion, claiming they had betrayed and abandoned him. The Warchief was rightly sceptical, but Gul'dan pointed out that the humans of Stormwind had had powerful spellcasters and the Warlocks had been in the Horde's defense against them. Now with the Warlocks gone, the human spellcasters could rip the Horde apart. Doomhammer needed him. Reluctantly, Doomhammer spared Gul'dan's life, and in exchange, Gul'dan promised to create a host of creatures that could stand against and crush the human magi. When Gul'dan was alone, a familiar voice rang within his mind. Kil'Jaeden. The demon came with more instructions, not to seek vengeance against Doomhammer by killing him. Doomhammer had succeeded where Blackhand had not. The Horde needed a leader like him in order to conquer more territory, unwittingly preparing Azeroth for the Burning Legion's invasion. If Gul'dan followed, further power would be granted to him. While Kil'Jaeden did intend to reward Gul'dan, the Warlock no longer trusted his benefactor. He had been abandoned by them for years. He had grown tired of being an expendable pawn. Gul'dan feigned obedience, but when the opportunity arose for him to claim the power within the Tomb of Sargeras, he would abandon the Horde and foil the Legion's plans. To reach the tomb, Gul'dan required loyal allies. An army to protect him from the rest of the Horde when he finally abandoned them. The Warlock convinced Doomhammer to grant him permission to form his own clan, the Stormreavers. Gul'dan told Doomhammer that this would mean all of his actions were visible. He would not be able to keep his affairs secret as he had done with the Shadow Council. Like any other clan, Gul'dan and his followers would be forced to fight on the front lines. What Gul'dan actually sought to do was to use the clan to increase its influence and power within the Horde. Doomhammer was no fool and could see through this. However, he was confident he could stay one step ahead of Gul'dan, so granted the Warlock his clan. Ogre would place spies among the clan to keep watch. Gul'dan's reputation had been shot. The Horde had turned against him and the use of fell magic. Doomhammer knew if the Warlock was to make an impact on the war, he would need a clan of his own. With assistance from Cho'Gall, Gul'dan began to create his warriors that would stand against the human magi. Gul'dan was not one to squander an opportunity. He would ensure that these new creations would ultimately be loyal to him rather than Doomhammer. While the Warchief had killed the Shadow Council, their spirits remained intact. Gul'dan was certain that if he brought his followers back from the dead, they'd be forever grateful to him. Both Cho'Gall and Gul'dan set about gathering the disembodied spirits of the Shadow Council warlocks. Gul'dan would also need vessels for these spirits. The First War had left so many dead, so the warlock's first consideration was to use the corpses of orcs and even ogres. With some additional thought, he knew the Horde would not stand for this desecration of their honoured dead. However, the Horde's traditional fervour would not be extended to the corpses of humans. Gul'dan would combine the Shadow Council's spirits with the corpses of Stormwind's great knights that fell during the war. With foul magic now outlawed, Gul'dan would seek to raise a host of powerful necromancers from the dead. Cho'Gall and Gul'dan committed several bloody rituals to reanimate the corpses. To unleash the necromantic energies required, they sacrificed the necrolytes that remained from the First War. Gul'dan considered these spellcasters an interesting experiment, but they had not proved as effective in combat as he had hoped, to their detriment. The necromantic energies coursed through the corpses, binding the Shadow Council's souls to them. The aberrations that rose from this experimentation would be called Death Knights. They would be capable of raising the dead, boiling the flesh of the living, and sacrificing a portion of an ally's life energy to make them invulnerable for a brief time. This was just a small taste of their power. These creations sickened Doomhammer. The Death Knights were unnatural and housed the souls of those responsible for destroying the Orcs' homeworld. He could not deny their potential though, and these new warriors did not use Fel. Their magics would not destroy the world around them as a byproduct. He accepted the Death Knights into the Horde. The longer he waited, he would lose the element of surprise against his next target, the human kingdom of Lordaeron. All Doomhammer needed to do now was replenish the Horde's dwindling supplies and armaments. He did this by invading the territory of Khaz Modan. This resource-rich territory was soon theirs, driving the dwarves and gnomes that populated the area into hiding. The fastest route to the kingdom of Lordaeron would be through the wetlands, a swampy and treacherous mire. It would be a grueling slog, transporting siege engines and an army through that terrain. After navigating the wetlands, the Horde would then come to the Thandal Span Bridge. This would be an easy location for the humans to defend effectively. The humans would likely expect the Horde to take this route, but Doomhammer refused to do the expected. He instructed the Horde to build ships. They would take the humans by surprise by sea. This plan did not sit very well with a lot of the Orcs. They were not a seafaring people, and some of the more superstitious clans feared the open seas. To Doomhammer's surprise, Gul'dan and his Stormreavers proved instrumental in persuading the other clans to follow along with Doomhammer's plan. The Warlock and his clan told the rest of the Horde that it was the best course of action and the voyage would be safe. Crude ships were constructed by the Ogres, who had some seafaring knowledge, and the Amani Troll tribe, a new ally Doomhammer had recruited during Gul'dan's coma. Further allies were also recruited to the Horde at this time. The goblins of the Steamweedle cartel provided new technologies, maps and information to the Orcs. They were also accomplished shipwrights, for the right amount of coin. Before their invasion of Lordaeron, the Horde had also been able to enslave the dragon aspect, Alexstrasza. The Dragonmaw clan had accomplished this truly impressive feat by using an artifact they had discovered and had dubbed the Demon Soul. The aspect was forced to lay eggs, birthing young dragons the Orcs would ride into battle. Dragons that did not obey the Orcs risked submitting their queen to excruciating torture or death. The humans became aware of the Horde's plans, scouting ships spotting the crude fleet. Rather than relent, Doomhammer sent his fleet straight away. The humans would not have time to muster their full strength before the Horde reached their shores. The Orcs made it to the shores of the Hillsbrad foothills relatively unscathed. They had been beset by human ships, but luckily the dragons were able to deal with them and push the humans into a retreat. Doomhammer sought to march through Hillsbrad and strike at Lordaeron's capital city. The humans had anticipated this, but were in disarray, only just managing to muster a defence to combat the Horde. This was the first time others of the Horde were able to see the destructive power of Gul'dan's Death Knights. A fetid fog spread out across the battlefield, raising humans that had been slain from the dead. The undead launched themselves at their former allies, striking them down. Doomhammer watched on with a mix of displeasure and satisfaction. He did not like how the Death Knights operated, but their effectiveness was undeniable. The humans had been preparing for the orcs as well, forming an alliance of the human kingdoms and getting some support from the dwarves and high elves. One of their greatest and newest weapons at their disposal were the paladins. Holy light radiated from these warriors, striking down the undead. Thanks to the paladins, the alliance was able to fight the Horde to a stalemate. Doomhammer knew the longer the Horde spent in Hillsbrad, the more time the alliance would have to call reinforcements. So he took a different tact. Part of his promise to the Amani trolls was to free their leader Zul'Jin. Doomhammer made good on that promise and won Zul'Jin over. To do this though, he promised to attack the territory of the trolls' mortal enemies, the High Elf kingdom of Quel'Thalas. Not entirely what Doomhammer wanted, but he knew he would need the trolls on side to stand a chance against the alliance. Gul'dan accompanied the Horde on their treacherous journey to Quel'Thalas. So far, Gul'dan had been spending a majority of his time building on the information he had ransacked from Medivh's mind. He researched further into powerful artifacts and discovered their locations. He kept much of this information a secret, but did share his findings with the Death Knights. Gul'dan did not have the time though to break away from the Horde during the war to go in search of these artifacts. Nobody did. The Horde decimated the Quel'Thalas outer holdings with relative ease. However, it was observed that both the Death Knights and the Amani Witch Doctor's spells were not as potent as they had once been. Gul'dan discovered the source of the magic dampening barrier that surrounded the Elven Kingdom. With Cho'Gall in tow, Gul'dan excitedly approached Doomhammer with his discovery. This did not put the war chief at ease, but Gul'dan said the discovery would help the Horde greatly. He escorted Doomhammer to the location. Forcing a gap in between the trees was a monolithic stone. Runes covered its surface and power radiated from it. Soon, the reason for Gul'dan's excitement became clear. He asked Doomhammer's permission to experiment with the runestone so that he may harness the power for the Horde. Doomhammer knew better than to give the treacherous warlock free rein to experiment. He asked Gul'dan what he intended with the stone. The warlock wanted to dismantle it, and with the bricks and slabs created, construct an altar, which he called an Altar of Storms. Gul'dan would then be able to channel the energy of the stones into the Horde's soldiers, transforming them into far more powerful beings than they had once been. Gul'dan did admit, though, this may lead to some disfigurement as well. The war chief pointed out that orcs had a severe mistrust of Gul'dan. Doomhammer doubted orcs would let Gul'dan experiment with them a second time, like when they drank the demon blood and became slaves to their bloodlust. Gul'dan gave a wicked smile. He assured Doomhammer he would not be using orcs, but creatures that would benefit from even more strength and wouldn't notice any reduction in intellect. Ogres. More strength is what the Horde needed right now, so knowing Gul'dan's plan, Doomhammer was happy to give permission for the warlock to experiment. Gul'dan was provided with a small workforce of ogres to help shatter the stone and construct the altar. The intelligent Cho'Gall was able to easily direct his vastly inferior kin in the construction of the Altar of Storms. As always, Gul'dan was doing this to benefit himself, not the greater good of the Horde. During the last few months, the warlock had been gathering power. He now held dominion over two powerful clans, the Stormreaver and the Twilight's Hammer clan, led by Cho'Gall. He had also been able to win over the spies that Doomhammer had placed among the ranks of the Stormreavers. Promises, power, threats, and other means meant they were now loyal to Gul'dan. The Death Knights, though, had not been as loyal as Gul'dan had hoped. The revived Shadow Council were loyal only to themselves. They fought alongside the Horde because it was in their own best interest to do so. With the Altar of Storms, Gul'dan hoped to create soldiers that would give him the strength needed to break away from the Horde and seek out the tomb of Sargeras. Gul'dan would have an army strong enough to keep away the force Doomhammer would inevitably send at him to punish the Warlock for his betrayal, long enough for Gul'dan to claim the power of the tomb for himself. One of the kingdoms conquered by the Orcs on Draenor was the High Maul Ogres. The High Maul had an ancient ritual for transforming the lesser of their kin into powerful two-headed ogre magi. Few knew this ritual, and almost all who had known the secret had perished. But Cho'Gall knew it. With help from his apprentice, Gul'dan handpicked the ogres to undergo the transformation and channeled raw arcane magics into the Altar of Storms. It was an absolute success, the ogres becoming as powerful as Gul'dan had hoped. More importantly, these ogres secretly swore undying loyalty to Gul'dan, giving the Warlock a force strong enough to break away from the Horde when the time was right. With the destruction of one of the many runestones that surrounded the Elven Kingdom, their magical barrier no longer dampened the magics of the Horde. Orgrim's forces stormed towards Quel'Thalas's capital, Silvermoon, terrorised the countryside, pillaged settlements and killed every elf they found. The Alliance came to the aid of the elves, and with that the elves joined the fold, but the orcs seemed unstoppable, as their army had now been enforced by red dragons in addition to the ogre magi. The elves had no physical weapons that could stop the Horde, so pulled back to their capital. Here, elven sorcerers summoned a giant barrier to encapsulate their capital. No matter what the Horde threw at the barrier, weapons, magic, or even the flaming breath of dragons, it would not give. Doomhammer's frustration deepened. The Horde was wasting their time here. He pulled his forces back and ordered them to march west. It was time to attack Lordaeron's capital. The roads and valleys between Quel'Thalas and Lordaeron were an easy route to take, but as a result, they were well fortified. Orgrim would once again do the unexpected, taking his army through the rugged Alterac Mountains, which would give the element of surprise. Zul'Jin declined Doomhammer's plan. The Trolls' hatred burned so strongly for the elves they would not abandon their siege on Silvermoon. This was troubling and infuriating. Doomhammer had come to rely heavily on the Amani to guide the Horde through a land that was not familiar to them. Losing the Trolls would spell doom for the Horde. Gul'dan was able to convince both Zul'Jin and Doomhammer he had found a way to destroy the barrier. As the runestones were also a product of the Sunwell, a magical font of energy the elves were attuned to, which Gul'dan likely learned from Medivh's mind, the Warlocks surmised he would be able to use their power to rip through the barrier. With the aid of his clan, the Stormreavers, Gul'dan told the two leaders it would likely take a few days for their work to bear fruit. Once it did, the barrier would come down and the Trolls would be able to sate their lust for vengeance and rejoin the Horde. Doomhammer was loath to leave more of his forces in Quel'Thalas, but Gul'dan's words swayed him. The Alliance forces were scattered. Now was the perfect time to attack Lordaeron, and Doomhammer could not let the opportunity slip through his fingers. The War Chief left the Stormreavers to unravel the barrier. Still not trusting Gul'dan, Orgrim ordered the Dragonmaw clan to keep watch over the Stormreaver, and if the barrier was not down in 3 days, the Dragonmaw would force the Stormreavers to rejoin the Horde. If Gul'dan resisted, the Dragonmaw had permission to feed the Warlock to one of their war mounts. Doomhammer took his force west. The Horde navigated the mountains far more quickly than the Alliance could have expected, partially due to a betrayal from one of the human kingdoms, Alterac, which granted the Horde safe passage. They began to batter Lordaeron's capital city. It seemed the Alliance was living on borrowed time. They fought with ferocity, but as soon as the Orcish enforcements came from But reinforcements never came. Doomhammer became worried. He had heard nothing from the Stormreavers, Twilight's Hammer or the Dragonmaw. Orgrim's unease deepened when he saw Alliance reinforcements coming from the east. He knew he could still win the war, but it was dependent on the forces still stationed at Quel'Thalas. Only a few days after the Horde had left for Lord'Aron's capital city, Gul'dan gathered his allies and revealed his plan to seek out the tomb of Sargeras. He bribed all those that followed him with the promise of immeasurable power, far more than what the Horde could provide. This swayed the opinion of most members of the Twilight's Hammer and the Stormreavers. The Amani trolls were completely disinterested, choosing to focus on destroying the elves. The Dragonmaw were also not swayed by Gul'dan's poisonous words, even moving to bar the Warlock's path. However, if the two forces clashed, they risked mutual annihilation. The Dragonmaw left the traitors behind and sought to join the rest of the Horde to warn Doomhammer. Gul'dan's forces moved south, encountering little resistance. A few humans dared stand in the Warlock's path, but they were easily dispatched. The traitors arrived where the Horde had first made landfall, the Hillsbrad foothills. They commandeered several vessels from the fleet and sailed to the west. The Dragonmaw arrived at Lord'Aron's capital city with dire news. Gul'dan had abandoned the Horde. Doomhammer had had certain victory snatched away from him because of one Orc's reckless quest for power. The Horde was now doomed to lose this war. Ogre would not let Gul'dan dishonour his people and get away with his treachery. The Horde went into full retreat in an effort to salvage their campaign, but Doomhammer sent the very powerful Blacktooth Grin clan after Gul'dan and Cho'Gall to punish them. This would mean the Horde were far less likely to salvage their position, but Gul'dan had to die for his dishonour. The Blacktooth Grin arrived at the ships not long after Gul'dan had sailed to the west. The clan boarded the rest of the vessels and gave chase. It was not just Doomhammer that had been betrayed by Gul'dan. Kil'Jaeden too became aware the Warlock had abandoned the Horde. The Legion needed the Horde to be successful to prepare Azeroth for their invasion, and without Gul'dan's forces, they seemed doomed to fail. Surprised and incensed by Gul'dan's betrayal, Kil'Jaeden began preparing to annihilate his former servant, but the leader of the Legion, Sargeras, stayed his hand. Sargeras didn't just want to annihilate the Warlock. He wanted to wait until Gul'dan was within an arm's reach of his goal of true power, and then snatch it away. The last thing Gul'dan would see before he died would be what he could have been. Gul'dan's voyage to the tomb's location was long and harsh. Eventually, the ships arrived. The tomb wasn't there. But this did not surprise Gul'dan. He knew the tomb lay at the bottom of the ocean. Gul'dan led his followers in a ritual, weaving his followers' magics into a single immense spell. The sky turned dark, and the ocean churned as the tomb slowly rose from the depths. The towering monument stood upon a barnacle-covered island. The spell had only just finished when the Blacktooth Grin were visible upon the horizon. Gul'dan knew he did not have much time. His forces were not enough to defeat the Blacktooth Grin, but with the tomb's power, Gul'dan would be able to crush them. The Warlock instructed Cho'Gall to hold the line along with his Twilight's Hammer clan, while Gul'dan and the Stormreavers entered the tomb. Gul'dan and his followers raced through the tomb's corridors as quickly as they could. It was not long, though, until they discovered the tomb was not abandoned. The tomb of Sargeras also acted as a prison for several demonic creatures that over the millennia had broken free of their confines. They patiently lurked in the shadows, and upon Sargeras' command, struck. The demons claimed Gul'dan's followers one by one, tearing them apart. As the warlock traversed the tomb, his followers being torn away from him, Gul'dan documented his journey upon the tomb's walls using his own blood. The most excruciating death was saved for Gul'dan. He was flayed alive, skin and muscle being torn from his bones, while his screams of pain shook the very foundations of the tomb of Sargeras. Only a few of the Storm Reavers survived, fleeing the tomb. Before they did, they claimed their master's head, believing that it held great power. Upon the island's shores, the Twilight's Hammer clan had been obliterated, the Blacktooth Grin either killing the clan soldiers or leaving them to die. Before the Blacktooth departed, they claimed Gul'dan's skull from his followers to prove their victory. The Horde would lose the Second War, but at least the warlock, who had sold out his people for power, and whose betrayal cost them dearly, had paid with his life. Despite his death, Gul'dan's dark shadow loomed over Azeroth for years to come. His followers were right. Gul'dan's skull became a powerful channeling totem for demonic energy. A small portion of Gul'dan's soul also remained within his skull, whispering to whomever held it. A portion of his memories remained as well. The location of the tomb of Sargeras and many other of Azeroth's great artifacts were contained within. After the Second War, much of the Horde was pushed back through the Dark Portal. They would not survive long on the dying Draenor. Ner'zhul rose to lead these survivors and concocted a plan to open portals to other worlds that the Orcs may conquer. Gul'dan's skull was recovered and used in the opening of these portals, and later used by the Alliance mage Khadgar to seal the Dark Portal. This prevented the chaotic energies created by the portals from spilling over into Azeroth, energies that utterly tore Draenor apart, morphing it into the world of Outland. Khadgar and his allies would be stranded on Outland for many years to come. Later, the Burning Legion somehow got their hands on Gul'dan's skull, and it was used to corrupt a large portion of woodland that would come to be known as Felwood during the Legion's second invasion of Azeroth, the first happening 10,000 years prior. The skull's demonic power would be absorbed by the demon hunter Illidan Stormrage. This turned the Night Elf into a part elf, part demon hybrid, empowering him enough to defeat the Legion General Tichondrius. The woodland would heal in time, but Illidan's transformation would see him banished from the rest of his kind. Illidan kept hold of Gul'dan's skull and could even be seen cradling it when heroes stormed his bastion in Outland, the Black Temple. Illidan had been using Gul'dan's memories to gather artifacts and power to one day defeat the Burning Legion. But at this time, Azeroth's heroes did not know this, striking down the Demon Hunter. Gul'dan is remembered as one of Azeroth's greatest mortal villains, and to this day is likely considered the most powerful mortal warlock to have ever lived. Well, that was until Gul'dan, the very same orc from a different timeline, who would surpass the main timeline warlock. However, that is a whole other story, and I'm going to finally finish this episode with the end of the main timeline Gul'dan story. I really hope you've enjoyed the story of the Horde's great betrayer. If you did, then you should absolutely help this podcast out. Give it a review on iTunes and follow it on Spotify. If you're listening on YouTube, give it a like, share, subscribe, and anything else I've missed off the list of things you now need to do to actually be shown the content of a channel on YouTube. I'm also playing through Warcraft Reforged right now, so why not give it a look? Along with any other content I feel like posting there. Instead of the usual bestiary section, before wrapping this episode, I'm going to give my 2 cents on Gul'dan, what I think of him as a character, etc. To be honest, despite Warlords of Draenor not being the best expansion, I was really glad it brought Gul'dan back as a mainline villain. I've always enjoyed just how out and out evil he is. There is never any remorse for his actions, and more often than not, he comes across as a slimy, scheming creep, while also coming across as a phenomenally powerful badass. However, Gul'dan being introduced in the Warlords of Draenor expansion saw his past quite heavily retconned, in my opinion, not for the better. Gul'dan was not from some unknown clan. He'd always been a part of Ner'zhul's Shadowmoon clan, and was the chieftain's apprentice. Kil'Jaeden did not approach Gul'dan first, but Ner'zhul. When Ner'zhul started to doubt the Horde's benefactor's intentions, Kil'Jaeden pivoted toward Gul'dan. I personally loved this, as it made Gul'dan seem an utterly despicable orc. He had grown up in this clan, held a high position, befriended its chieftain, yet was still willing to sell them out at the drop of a hat. What an actual dick. The Unknown Clan story arc tries to make you empathise with Gul'dan, that his evil was born from abuse. Sometimes people are just evil, and I found the previous approach to Gul'dan a lot more satisfying because of that. The Unknown Clan arc also says Gul'dan was born deformed. This is another retcon. Gul'dan has always been physically weak for an orc, but he was still perfectly able-bodied before the release of Warlords of Draenor. Now, I'm not denying this makes the new Gul'dan's design look extremely cool and badass. The hunched over figure with giant tusks coming out of his back, yeah, it's pretty awesome. But there's something about the root of Gul'dan's evil, being a disability, after all this is why he gets abused, that does not sit right with me. To be honest, I'm probably reading way too much into that, but that's just my opinion. Either way, I'd still put Gul'dan pretty damn high up on my list of favourite villains in Warcraft, probably even top 5 material, and also pretty high up my list of favourite characters in general. In short, it's good to be bad. Next time, we'll start to look at card lore from the latest expansion. I hope you're ready for the Ashes of Outland content. There are some great lore characters being added to the game with this expansion. Until next time, bye bye.